For session 2 of day 4, we'll have a masterclass on how to produce health stories that have a meaningful impact. The session will be led by Eli Cahan, who was a 2023 NPF Future of the American Child Fellow. He's also an award-winning investigative journalist who has produced features for ProPublica, Rolling Stone, and the LA Times, among other platforms. And in his spare time, he's also a neonatal intensive care doctor at Stanford University. Eli is joined by Jason Mast. He's a general assignment reporter at STAT, a health news website celebrating 10 years of reporting from the frontiers of health and medicine. Jason focuses on the science behind new medicines and whether that science ever reaches patients. And Taiwo Adebulu joins us. He is the features and investigations editor at TheCable, a Nigerian independent digital newspaper where he supervises journalism projects that drive public accountability and a desire to spark reform in Africa. Taiwo is also a 2023 NPF Rare Diseases Reporting alum. Thank you all so much for joining us. And Eli, please take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Ms. Jones, for having us. Obviously, deeply grateful to the National Press Foundation for all their support of so much amazing work, including my own. Really honored and grateful to be able to moderate this panel, and very grateful to my co-panelists here, Taiwo and Jason, coming at you from I believe it's like 14 hours of time zones that we're across right now. So I know you guys have been all across the world, and I think this panel is trying to be representative too in terms of at least time zone representation. So we I think have the remit and the privilege of being able to talk about hopefully some of the fun stuff, which is actually how to go out and report these stories, how to think about these stories, and how to tell them in a way that is built for impact. And we're gonna sort of walk through how we have approached these questions and how we think about this. And obviously, we'll leave time for questions at the end. Welcome, any questions that come up in the middle. You can type them into the chat, and we'll try to get them at the end. But I think we wanted to start sort of at first principles, which is, how do you even think about your story selection here? Like, what's a good story on rare diseases? How do you think about that? What are the categories of stories that you might think about? And I think it's worth saying that, I know you guys have had your lots of content lectures that Rachel and the NPF gang have put together. I think one of the first things that I try to think about when Rachel asked me to do this panel is, what counts as a rare disease and what doesn't. And I think traditionally we think about rare diseases as, congenital genetic disorders, that kinds of, I'm literally in the NICU right now because I have to work right after this. And we have 40 kids here, at least four of whom we know have pretty serious congenital genetic disorders. And those are the ones we've tested, right? And we can get into, testing. That's a whole other question. But, that's what we traditionally think of as rare diseases, are these congenital genetic diseases, metabolic diseases, these sorts of things. But obviously, the definition of rare disease is not defined on a class of disease. It's defined in terms of statistics, which means that diseases that are uncommon, but may hold cultural sort of like hold cultural capital and hold mind share for folks may count as rare diseases. So that is also true, as we'll get into, based on where you are. So a disease may not be defined as rare in a certain locality. For example, Taiwo is in on the African subcontinent, where obviously malaria and sickle cell are not rare, but if you look at certain communities in the United States, they may be classified as rare diseases. I think it's also worth saying, while we're talking about things like malaria, that there are lots of infectious diseases that again may not be classified as rare diseases in some places, may be classified as rare diseases in others. That is changing very quickly with climate change, as we'll get into. And then to say nothing of other conditions like cancers, which hold a lot of obviously cultural capital and mind share, but statistically are incredibly rare and would classify as rare diseases. So anyway, I just wanted to level set on that as we start thinking about how, like, you come out of this workshop and you come out of this week and you say, oh my God, my mind is overflowing in knowledge. Like, what the heck am I going to write about? And I think the first question is, well, what would count? Like, what would classify? So sort of before or I want to like turn to my panelists here and shut my fat mouth. I'm curious, Jason, Taiwo, as you guys think about embarking on reporting around a rare disease, how are you thinking about the architecture of a story and the kinds of things that you're looking into to decide whether this is something worth undertaking?
I apologize, my internet broke off there for a second. You're asking sort of what is a story that how do you decide basically what is a good story here?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is like it is sort of like your definition of rare disease, incredibly broad. I mean, I think there's sort of there's a few different buckets of rare disease stories that are often bread and butter, which of medical and science reporting. Often this looks like scientists discover a new rare disease and then researchers try to build a cure for it. Scientists find a new way to cure a rare disease, and then you figure out, okay, can you actually actualize this? Can you actually scale this? And sort of you can look at sort of two great examples last couple of years. One sort of being on sickle cell, where as like Tyler, you've written about, there's been this cure-ish not that's actually scaled. You can look at sort of one of the biggest rare disease stories of the last year with baby KJ, this kid that they've managed to create this custom gene editing treatment for, and sort of whether or not that provides a level of like the excitement around that and whether or not that can provide a cure for other folk. So that's one bucket. There's other buckets that are just sort of looking, and the New York Times has done some great stuff on this, Gina, there, of just like looking at the toll that a rare disease can take on this and on families and sort of the lived experience that goes well beyond anything medical and can be really humanizing. There is the stories that have gotten a lot of press over the last, I'd say, maybe decade, and then I've written about, and others of like parents who become drug developers because of a rare disease. And then, depending on what your definition is, you can, if you put sort of neglected tropical diseases into that bucket, which are rare in the US, where Eli and I both are, and where a lot of like funding are common globally. There's a ton of reports around that. I think really it just comes, and there's also like a bucket of like that's come out recently. And Sarah Zhang at The Atlantic has done really great reporting on this, of okay, if there's actually a cure or there's actually a really powerful treatment, what do people do afterwards? And that's actually really a really interesting and really deeply human area to explore. So there's all these different buckets. I think it all really just comes down to like, can you tell a compelling human story? And all of those essentials are going to be all of those things that like make us human are going to be in that story. And people will care about it, even if it's, affects 30 children or affects 200,000 children.
Yeah, I think for me, like I would often say, the issue of rare has to be defined locally. It comes from the issue of local context. Like Cahan said, uh, let's look at the issue of sickle cell disease, sickle cell disorder. Sickle cell disorder is considered a rare disease globally, but in Africa, especially in West Africa, it's quite common. One in every Nigeria has the highest burden of sickle cell disease, right? And that means that one in every Nigerian carries the sickle cell disorder. So in Nigeria, in West Africa, it's quite common, but across the world, globally, it is considered a rare disease. And number two, let's look at Lassa fever. Lassa fever is a rare infectious disease all over the world. It's globally defined as a rare disease. But in West Africa, where it is endemic, it may not be defined as a rare disease. Nevertheless, it's a disease that is endemic the region, and we have about maybe less than 900 people infected with Lassa fever currently. Just like Ebola, it's also an infectious rare disease. So I think it has to be contextualized locally. For example, during my fellowship last year, I looked at the story I could tell that resonates with my locality. So, and most of the experts spoke about the issue of gene editing technology, gene therapy, and all that, the new advancements in rare disease cure, early detection, and all that. So, and I thought, now, if the topical thing at the moment is gene editing technology, how can I localize it? What story can I tell that can reflect my environment, that can say something about Nigeria, where I come from? So I looked at the whole thing, and there is no way you can talk about gene editing, gene technology, and you take away sickle cell out of it. Although sickle cell is still globally defined as a rare disease. So I said, okay, let me look at this advancement. How does it better an ordinary Nigerian? So I looked at the fact that although the gene editing technology is the thing at the moment, now I now started questioning, is this quite beneficial to Nigeria? And I looked at the fact that the treatment for gene editing should be about $2 million. Then, I think as of last year, and in Nigeria, we have the issue of economic depravity as well, because let me say most Nigerians, so let me say half of Nigerians, or more than 50% of Nigerians, live on less than $2 a day. And we're talking about a treatment of $2 million. So my story centers on the fact that how do we benefit in such a situation where poverty is also as endemic as this rare disease, and also the fact that we are battling with poor health infrastructure. So where does Nigeria stand into a whole conversation about gene editing? That was what my story was all about. So in telling your story, you have to look at the conversation, that's how the conversation, how you can weave the conversation around your environment, how the conversation matters to your country. For example, if you look at maybe rare disorders like kyphosis, it may not be a rare disease, but there are some types of kyphosis like congenital kyphosis that's quite a rare disorder. And that's another disorder that some of us can localize in West Africa. So look at your local community, look at conversation, look at recent policies. And for me, for every story, it starts from an excellent research. So when you've got excellent research, you can now continue to question so many things. And from having such grasp, from having such excellent research, you need to have an excellent grasp of the concept that you want to write about. If I do not have an excellent grasp of a rare disease that I intend to write about, I may have certain issues explaining the story to my audience, because we're talking about science. And in writing science, you have to break down the jargons, you have to break down the concepts, you have to speak with experts and all that. So it starts from good research skills, then you need to have a good grasp of the whole concept. Then at the end of the day, you need to be interested in that particular concept. For me, I was quite interested in sickle cell disease because I know people who are sickle cell patients. They are all around me. And for me, writing such a story will help them realize that there is hope somewhere, although the hope will be far away from them because they cannot afford such gene editing technology at the moment. And we do not have any hope that such a technology will be in Nigeria even in the next 10 years or in the next 12 years. We cannot tell. But I just want to preach the message of hope that there's something out there that can actually make life better as a sickle cell disease carrier. So in telling your story, you have to look at local concepts. What's that research that most people are talking about? What's that new issue? What's that policy issue? What is that cure that you think you can write about that can give hope to certain areas of rare diseases in your area?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you guys so much for that. I think that's those are such important points. I'm curious, like, Jason, you mentioned some maybe archetypal stories, and I'm curious if there are other things that I know some organizations will have a qualitative or quantitative rubric that they use to evaluate stories. I know that the two of you said that your organizations don't have one that you're going to use deliberately, but I'm curious, from what you've heard and from your conversations with colleagues, what are the elements of the story that people are looking for to say, okay, this is worth undertaking? Obviously, the pioneering scientist or the fearless advocate or the survival against all odds or the breakthrough new therapy. These are all sort of classic narratives that certainly can be applied in the rare disease space. Are there other things that you guys look for? Because, I think the sort of elephant in the room here is inherently and by definition, these stories are only going to be directly relevant to a small audience of people, right? Like the exact fact that these are stories about small populations mean that they are directly relevant only to small populations. So I'm curious how you even begin to think about, well, I'm going to write this story, but it's going to be relevant to many more people than those with the disease themselves.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways of it is an inherent tension, and it is like much as I will say, like, if there's a human story, folks will read it. Fewer people will read it than if you are writing about Alzheimer's, or if you're writing about at least in the US, like prostate cancer, things that affect millions of people, or diabetes, the GLP-1 weight loss drugs. So that is an inherent tension. There are a couple ways, though, I think of if that's a concern, getting at larger issues, and that can make a story much more compelling. So, for example, you might say, "Hey, this is a disease." I'll take the example of baby KJ, the infant who was treated with the CRISPR-based medicine in May or in January. You might say, "Hey, this affects this one baby and this one disease that affects, maybe 50 patients a year." And that is, you might not care, but the approach could be applied to a lot of different um, disorders. So you can immediately get at ways of like, oh, this is a broader thing that is being illuminated or being out on a rare disease. You can also, there's a piece that I'm about to sort of start reporting about. A rare disease that is neurodevelopmental, and they've had some success of late, and with some new medicines. And it seems that like the success that they're having might point to a new understanding of how the brain works. That there is, in fact, more you can do at a later stage than we, in terms of rewiring memory and in terms of how our brain develops, than we had thought previously. So that's, it's a very rare disease. And most people will have never heard of the disease and have no idea, and know no one who is affected by it. But they will care about that broader scientific issue and that broader issue of like, what make of what, how our brain works. There's also uh, there's also just like the rhetorical, and it's somewhat rhetorical, and somewhat real device that people will use, which is to just put in a story that, like, look, rare diseases might be individually rare, but they're affect 25 to 30 million people. I think that's a global number, it might be a US number. I forget. Uh, Almost certainly a US number. And I think that helps, but it doesn't get you all the way there.
Well, for me, as storyteller, I do not want to really box my stories. I do not want to box my ideas within a certain frame. So for me, what matters is the fact that am I speaking sense to my local audience? Because most of the time, like I deduced earlier, I do not want to define rare disease based on the United States definition or the global definition. Most of the time, I want to look at my local audience. I want to look at the people that I'm speaking to. Sometimes it will be a very small audience, that could be your listeners, that could be your readers. And such a story could actually hit the right point. So for me as a storyteller, I just look at the story. Is this story worth telling? Who are the people that I actually want to pass the message across to? If it's just about, let me say, 1 million people, major stakeholders, or people that really need hope to know about successes, about certain stories, maybe about carriers who think maybe their issues are quite uh, known to them or quite peculiar to them, but they really do not know that it's other people are actually affected by such an issue. So most of the time, I do not want to box my story or my idea within a particular form. I just want to tell the story, allow the world know that this is what is happening. These are the concepts around it, and this is what the experts are talking about. These are the successes, these are the hindrances, and these are the future projections.
I'm curious there. That's how in the con. So you're talking about like sort of making things local, um, which I really like. I'm curious, and has worked really well in your reporting. I'm curious, what do you do in cases where it's rare, even on a local level, where like I think you've written about like meningitis cases that I assume are somewhat rare, even on a local level. Like, how do you, but maybe not. Like, if it's rare on a local level, how do you think about that?
Like I said, I produce my story most of the time for the local audience first before I think of the international audience. So, for example, I do not think meningitis is a rare disease, although some kinds or categories of meningitis could be quite rare. But in Nigeria, where it's even endemic around the Zindel region, around there is a meningitis belt in Africa. So it may not be quite rare, and I don't think it's globally defined as a rare disease. But for me, in as much it's a local concept, in as much it is recognized locally, I tell my story locally, and I want the people out there to also see it as a local story and tap into what is happening in Africa and Nigeria. So for me, I write my story for the immediate people. So in as much I write for a digital newspaper. So when my story is written, it could be read anywhere in the world. People in the United States, people in Asia, people in South Asia, people in um, the Americans. So it could be read anywhere in the world. So for me, I look at the local concept. If it is whether it is rare or not, I just want to tell the story and give hope to people who deserve such hope. But nevertheless, I will still need to define whether such a disease is rare or whether it is not rare. Whether it is rare or not rare, people are suffering. And that's one thing we need to recognize as storytellers. People are suffering from this disease and they want hope, they want cure. So I think that matters in how we conceive these stories and write them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think listen, anyone from the United States knows in People Magazine or Us Weekly, I don't know. One of those celebrity magazines, they have the like pictures of the celebrities doing everyday things and it's celebrities that are just like us. And I think in the same way, trying to find common ground between the experience of folks with, these illnesses and the experiences of folks with lots of other illnesses is essential. I know certainly the experience of parenting a sick child is universal. So, the stories about, caregiving for folks with rare diseases, whether they are children or whether they're adults, feel often like they strike a chord when I've done those stories, or when I've spoken with those patients. I think why don't we sort of move into the next phase of our discussion, which is I'd love to pull the conversation a little bit out of theoretical land and discuss with the two of you stories that you have done. And I'm curious how you thought about approaching these stories, and applying kind of everything we've talked about to those stories. Um, maybe, you know, why don't we start with you, Jason? you have done, as anyone who's read your work knows, tireless, really incisive reporting on the developments around treatments for muscular dystrophy, in particular around this one company called Sarepta Therapeutics, which had quite a fascinating and complicated regulatory and commercialization pathway that seemed to seesaw every 5 minutes. I think it's an interesting story not only because it is, a population muscular dystrophy that people know about and think about amongst rare diseases, but also I think repertorially your choice of pursuing that story is an interesting one, as we've discussed, because other people were doing this story, right? Like this was not like you were the only one reporting on this. This was fairly saturated, certainly when there was the whipsawing about, FDA approvals and whatnot. Lots of other people were covering this story. And so I'm curious how you thought about, in general, doing this story in a way that was going to be unique, and then why you weren't worried that, other people were reporting on this in a set of diseases that you could probably convince yourself, well, this is such a small space. If one person is out there reporting on it, then who am I to be the second one?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's sort of, I guess, probably two answers. One is that we cover biotechnology, the biotech industry, and gene therapy, rare diseases as our remit, and so there isn't a way for us to entirely back out of the story. Um, Altogether. Like we have to be writing about this. And or maybe three answers. And then secondarily to that, like we had been writing about this for I guess 2 years in this particular drug for 2 years before it had I guess launched into this public controversy in the same way. And so I felt like we had both the mandate just from like a business structure and what our audience is, and then also from um, sort of what we had been had the mandate, and then also had the experience and the sourcing to cover it um, from a unique angle, or at least to bring something. Um, it does, I will say, the fact that you know that like the New York Times, that Bloomberg, that Wall Street Journal, that all these other publications will also be covering this does, I guess, motivate you to report a little bit faster and to try to go a little bit deeper than you might otherwise do, or at least you would have taken a little bit longer time doing. And I think that's good. Um, and then secondarily, there is this, and I think actually some people in the patient community are rightly rightly actually object to the amount of focus there has been on this, and I think they have some pretty fair grievances on that side. At the same time, it does go, or at least one can argue that it goes a little bit beyond just this one rare disease and goes to like, what are the standards that the FDA should have? What are the standards that we should have before approving new drugs? What are the limits of what our current technologies can do? Where do we draw the line between, I guess, patient access and corporate profiteering? All of these bigger, knottier questions um, that encompass all of medicine and all of regulatory. And you also, on top of that, had this new FDA, and so this Trump angle to it all. And so there was both, I guess, in synopsis, like both a lot of experience that we had, a audience mandate, and then a larger issue that was at play, or at least one could say it was at play.
Yeah. And we'll sort of get a little bit deeper into craft here. Want to ask you how you found these sources, how you thought about doing the storytelling, that sort of thing. But I think let's sort of shift to Taiwo. Taiwo, as you were conceptualizing some of the stories in particular around, gene therapy and sickle cell. I know you've mentioned how you think about localizing these stories, how you think about bringing them into the context in which you're writing. Can you say a little bit more about, how you thought about storytelling in gene therapy for your audience? And again, how you took something as sort of newsworthy and certainly covered as gene therapy and the development of gene therapy across the world and brought it home.
So first of all, I always see myself as a storyteller, as a journalist. That's where it begins. Because when you are writing science, science is quite complex. It's difficult for people to understand. So first of all, I see myself as a storyteller. And I ask myself the first question. Now, this is science. I'm a storyteller. How do I bring science to my audience, make them understand, make them digest the whole story, and feel like the story is for them? So the first thing I do most of the time is the fact that I ask myself, how do I tell the story? I'm interested in this story. Now, the fellowship is about rare disease, and I have researched about all the rare disease, the perspective, the research going on, and what people are talking about. And I decided to pick interest in sickle cell disease. Now, how do I weave everything and make my audience understand the fact that this is a topical issue, and a lot of people are carriers of this particular disorder or disease? Now, and everything after thinking about everything, I said, okay, how do I tell the story? And that is where everything begins for me. Now, I saw a particular question in the group chat, and I'm going to weave that into what I'm going to say. Now, I did a story on Lassa fever, which is quite endemic to West Africa as well. So, like I said, I start with the fact that I'm a storyteller. And for every story I tell, I have to humanize that because humans are at the receiving end of everything we are talking about. And as a storyteller, if you do not humanize the story, you are practically like a researcher. You are practically writing the same research that you're quoting. So as a journalist, the first thing is the fact that you are a storyteller and you have to humanize your story because in everything that we do, humans are the center of everything. We're always talking about the fact that how are humans affected? How are people affected? How does this give hope to people? How does carriers know that this particular issue they can get a cure for it? How do researchers know the mind of maybe the sources or the patients that you are speaking with? So in telling such a story about Lassa fever, I weaved the story around about two doctors who died due to complications from Lassa fever because they didn't have a lot of personal protective equipment, and there were a lot of cultural issues around Lassa fever as well. So I had to weave the story around those two doctors, how they died due to complications arising from Lassa fever. And then from there, I went into the whole scientific issue about Lassa fever, the concept about Lassa fever, the what data says about Lassa fever in Nigeria, what let me say agencies of government are doing to actually make sure that we do not record more cases of Lassa fever. So for me, I start as a storyteller. I want to tell a story first before going to the science of what I want to write about. So from the beginning, I look at the fact that how do I tell a compelling story? So on that particular issue of sickle cell disease, for me from the beginning, it was about storytelling. How do I tell a story? And in telling such a story, I ask myself, how do I even start? Because I have to hold my audience, my readers, spellbound right from the very beginning. And that's one of the challenges we have as science writers. People often get bored of science stories. So if you're writing about a rare disease, and you start from complex issues, trust me from the very beginning, people might not read. And I need to keep my readers glued to my story. So I have to start from something, a story. So I see myself as a storyteller. I have to start from a compelling story that's going to attract them. And there's something I often tell my reporters that if you give me a draft, the first thing I have to ask you is how sexy is your first introduction? How sexy are your introductory paragraphs? Can you keep me glued to your story for the next 30 minutes or for the next 15 minutes? So if I can tell a compelling story right from the very beginning, then I can now drive my readers towards the concept that I'm talking about. Then at the end of the day, you're going to write a compelling story or a beautiful story that is worth reading. But from the very beginning, I need to see myself as a storyteller. Now, like I said initially, you need to have a full grasp of the concept and you must have done excellent research before you now say, okay, let me start writing the story. But at the end of the day, see yourself as a storyteller. Having the concept alone is not enough. How do you drive the concept home to people that you actually want to read your story? So for me, from the very beginning, trying to humanize the story, trying to tell a compelling story matters. Because at the end of the day, if your story is not compelling, there is no way you can actually grab the attention of people. I don't know if it's gonna be like a journal, or you're just writing to people who are not actually reading you. So that's what I think about from the very beginning. So I see myself as a storyteller. I want to tell a story. I want to humanize as much as possible. And at the end of the day, I end up introducing them to the science, introducing them to the concept of the story and whatever it is I want to talk about.
Yeah. So this transitions perfectly into the next phase of our discussion, which is, well, not the sexy writing. We'll get to the sexy writing because if it's not sexy, people won't read it. But let's talk about the people, right? Because what I hear you saying, Taiwo, and what Jason I know is at the heart of many of your stories are the patients themselves, the human beings, not the disease, not the victims, but these human beings with agency and lives and passions and emotions and love and care and fears and hopes and dreams. And so let's talk about those people for a second. And namely, I'm curious, how do you think about finding these people? Whether they are the patients themselves, whether they're the advocates, whether they're the parents, whether they're the doctors, whether they're the legislators and scientists. How do you think about finding these people from a reportorial standpoint? How do you think about convincing them to talk to you? Jason, maybe we'll start with you for this one.
Yeah, so I'll get to the patients last. This is a great question and one that I'm still not certain that I've gotten down fully. Or I'm sure that I've not gotten down fully. Um, as far as doctors, there's PubMed, and you can see who is publishing on XYZ. You can see if there isn't, or if you talk to anyone who's publishing relatedly, they will likely know who the best person is and can point you to, oh, this person, especially in rare disease where there's often like a very small number of people, like this is the small expert group of experts, and often these people are very compelling characters in journalism because they really care about XYZ disease, and they've really have these strong bonds with their patients and with their families. As far as talking to patients, patient advocacy groups, as I think a few folks have mentioned in the chat, are I would say really the starting point. And where one begins is not the only point of contact, but they will often, especially if it's a really rare group, be able to point you, like be able to talk to you, give you an introduction to the rare disease, to what they're concerned about, to what they're thinking about, to their any qualms they have as about reporting on this, as there will almost certainly be, or will often be some. Um, and then we'll also be able to point you to families who are in would be good for you to talk to, would be good to or maybe involved in whatever trial you're reporting on, or whatever intersects with your specific angle on this. There are other ways, and some of these are good. You should talk to, if it's a large enough like rare disease, there will be other patient groups, and those patient groups might disagree, and so you should talk to multiple ones. People also post on Facebook and other social media platforms. Be very respectful when reaching out to these folks. Be like, say who you are, say it's fine if they don't respond, or they have no interest in. Advocacy groups, PubMed, social media, two places.
Yeah,
Uh,
can I ask a little bit about that?
okay.
Let's just talk for 1 second, Taiwo. I'm just gonna ask one follow-up. In terms of social media, Can you just say a little bit more about the brass tacks of like actually finding people on social media? Because more and more people are saying, well, you find some people on TikTok, you find some people on Reddit. I have done lots of reporting on these platforms. I have found that it's incredibly unique the way in which you get in touch with people on each respective platform. Jason, do you want to say a little bit about how you think about using social media? Are there stock strategies that you're taking right when from the outset when you're reporting a story to try to track people down?
Yeah, so there's a few different yes, it is very idiosyncratic to whichever platform we can like and I'm sure we could talk for a long time about the use of Reddit, which is its own like can of worms. But I think so on let's take Facebook and say Twitter or Blue Sky. Facebook, there are Facebook patient groups or disease specific groups. I early on in my career, I joined a couple of them explaining exactly who I was in the process. I have generally now shied away from that and see those, borrowing from another reporter who pointed this out, see those as spaces for patients and those communities that maybe journalists should not be a part of. There are exceptions to this. I know people who do use these and can't.
I don't know what happened to Jason.
I think.
Um, yeah, Taiwo, you wanna jump in?
Yes, I need to be very honest because I think this is the most difficult question in the whole thing because getting to meet these people, getting to know them could be quite difficult, I must confess. And at the end of the day, I need to be very, very honest. You may not get to tell the kind of story that you want because possibly you might not get to meet the sources, the patients, and all that. But one thing that has really worked for me is the fact that I often collaborate with NGOs who deal with some of these issues. There are a lot of NGOs who actually handle health initiatives. There are some NGOs that actually have access to some of these patients. So when I speak to some of these NGOs, they make the access quite easy for me because I have used social media before, and at the end of the day, the doors are off, the door gets shut and they tell me I don't want my story told, I'm shy, I don't want people to know about this and that. And there are sometimes they could have spoken about their condition on social media, possibly on TikTok. But when you meet them personally and they realize that you are a journalist and you want to project their story out there, they become quite reserved and they don't want to let you in into their world. But if you meet people that they actually trust, especially NGOs, that have worked with them, they become quite more open. And I'm saying this based on experience because I told a story around a disease at one particular point in time. I tried to speak with people on Twitter. I tried to speak with people on TikTok, but they didn't want to talk to me. And they had already made their condition open on social media. All they needed to do was to talk to me, but they didn't want to talk. They didn't trust me. They didn't know me. Maybe it's they felt I could have trivialized their issue or I could have sensationalized. People really do not trust journalists at one point. But if you collaborate with NGOs, with experts who have worked with these people, who actually know them, who they trust, it's quite easy for them to open up to you. And in such a case that they do not really want to tell their story, there is practically nothing you can do about it. It's their story, and you cannot force them to tell such a story. But for what has worked for me, collaborating with NGOs, with agencies that have worked with these people, it becomes quite open because they have the access in the first place, and they know the kind of people that will speak with you. So for me, that's one of the ways through which one can actually get these patients and get them to talk to you.
Eli, forgive me for interrupting here, but I know you're going to have to leave in 15 minutes. And so I wanted to make sure that we got this one question specifically for you from Alicia Garceau. Alicia, could you ask your question, please?
Yeah, hi, Eli. I'm a journalist based in Indianapolis, in the United States. And I just was thinking about your story for Rolling Stone and long COVID, and thinking about some of these conditions that maybe aren't well understood. There's a lot of misinformation around them. And so I'm just wondering how you approach stories like that when maybe even experts disagree about the condition.
Yeah, yeah, I so appreciate the question. First of all, I think with compassion, right? I think you try to take people um, and understand that while there is debate about the science and the pathways that are making somebody ill, the fact of their illness is still true, and certainly their reality and their symptoms are what they are. I also think if you approach these uh, scenarios of controversy in the medical establishment or in the scientific establishment about the legitimacy or the nature of a disease, those are often really interesting stories, right? Like there's debate at the Thanksgiving dinner table in the scientific establishment about long COVID. And I think we tried to capture some of that. Frankly, we had written more. When I originally filed the story at like 7,000 words, my editor was like, we need to hack away at some of this. But I think we tried to get at that. And then I think the other thing that we tried to do is, as Taiwo and Jason have said, these people, these kids that we were talking about in the story, for anyone who hasn't read the story, it was about sort of the impact of long COVID on children in particular, and the long tail of that illness on many aspects of their life, including on education. And so I think we were also in a position where we said, well, we could write this as a science story, but the work that we do together at Rolling Stone is always sort of thinking about science and illness in the setting of society and culture. And so the question here was, well, what is it about long COVID that we can say that speaks to the human condition of long COVID, not just to whether or not they have a diagnosis or the availability of treatment or what federal policies were around that. And I think, looking to the school system and education is something I always try to do, because in pediatrics, it's sort of inextricable, this connection between the hospital and schools, or in particular because kids spend most of their waking hours in school. I think this was a golden opportunity to also take a deep look at, and from an accountability and impact lens, well, what rights are people afforded, and are they getting those rights? And in this case, we found like putatively, from this subset of people that we spoke to, it seems like there may be widespread variability at sort of best, and violations at worst in terms of the access of children to their disability entitlements in school. So I think that's some of how we thought about it. I know, Rachel, I'm glad that you sort of jumped in. I know we certainly have lots of other things on our agenda that we planned on talking about. It's probably as good an opportunity as any to sort of just open the floor for questions. I see a ton in the chat, so I've not been moderating this thing. I will defer to you, Rachel, to try to pull out some of these, or otherwise I think we can just open the floor for questions. I know Jason, Taiwo, and I think that's a lot more fun than us talking about amongst ourselves.
Hey, Eli, do you have a hard stop at 10:15?
I would say I have a hard stop probably at 10:22. Yeah. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
well, I'll
I have
try
to
to be
start
more.
rounding pretty soon afterwards. So I just have to run and print out my list and stuff.
Let's hear from Stephen Kenechi from Nigeria then. Stephen?
Hi. My question goes to Taiwo. I specifically wanted to know how he thinks journalists can navigate the use of multimedia. How do we minimize the risk of unwanted exposure while ensuring that we present the stories of our sources in the most ethical and responsible manner?
Stephen, I need to be quite blunt here. when you consider, we've not talked about the issue of ethics yet, because when you're talking about covering or reporting diseases and health issues, there are a lot of ethical issues that we have to talk about. And you cannot flout journalistic ethics just because you want to tell a compelling story. It could be disastrous. And that is why I say, at the end of the day, not every story could be worth telling. I will not tell the exact story that you want to tell because you cannot flout ethical issues. Now, if you look at some of the stories that I did about meningitis, the intersection between meningitis and COVID-19, that particular story, you would realize that I had to cover the faces of the minors, the children in particular.
Okay.
That was the first thing I did. And also, if you don't speak with an adult, such an adult does not want exposure. You can actually take a photo of such a person from behind.
Okay.
You can take a photo of the.
That was actually a very good point. There are ways to be creative in using multimedia that protect patients. Um, I think his mic may be frozen, so we'll go now to Asako in Japan.
Hello, thank you so much for your insights today. So my name is
So from the.
Asako.
Such does not give a room.
Taiwo?
Hello, can you hear me? Am I
Yeah,
audible? Am I
so
audible?
we have moved on to
Yes, just a
Asako
minute.
now, but we'll come back to you. Okay, Asako?
Okay.
Okay, so my name is Asako and I am a journalist based in Japan. So my question might sound a bit personal because I am also a rare disease patient myself, and I feel like I am lost on how to report about it. So I have experience and also watching my fellow patients, I know that there's isolation and also misunderstanding. And I know that I can use my tool as a journalist to raise our voices and to be heard. But I feel like I'm just lost and I don't know where to begin. Because should I speak out as a patient or should I focus specifically on my own condition? But as a journalist, I've always tried to keep objective perspective, and I'm just too worried that it might sound too subjective. If you have any advice on that, I will be so grateful. Thank you.
I don't have any detailed advice, but I would just say that I can think of some really good reporting. Actually, also on long COVID and some other areas that have where you have both the personal and subjective experience of the author who is a patient, and then there is also all of these interviews with experts and with other patients, and I mean, that I think is often the best reporting that's there because you both get this deep reporting from someone who's experienced as a journalist and can be objective and can talk to all these people, and you have the personal experience that comes from being a patient that myself or Eli can talk to or like Taiwo can talk to a million people, but we're still not going to get that level of subjective experience. And that I think, so there are these sort of like reported essays or first person reporting that I think has worked really well, and I can send over some examples. So I don't have any great advice other than that. I think you can really do some great reporting there. That's all.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I should say, I mean, Japan has a long history in terms of being one of the leaders in rare disease research and diagnostics and treatment, as you know. I mean, IRUD is like one of the global leaders in terms of rare disease assessment, and I know like the entire idea of Nambio and like this concept of, why we should afford government resources to this sort of thing is a global leader. So obviously you're quite well positioned in the history of the country and the country's approach to rare disease to try to tell these stories. And as Jason said, your lived experience hopefully should only form to sort of give you the right questions to ask, right? I mean, I think about this a lot because people ask me often to write in first person as a doctor, and I don't do that as a like almost exclusively as a rule. I don't do that because first of all, I think that's not how I was trained as a journalist, and I think I think if we value objectivity as a really important fundamental piece of journalism, um, anything that could imperil objectivity, I think is worth thinking about. Obviously, there's lots of debate now about like is objectivity worth as much as we've historically said it is, and we can talk more about that, over a drink or something. But I think that's the traditional teaching. I think where I try to use my lived experience clinically or elsewhere is to try to ensure that I know the right questions to ask, right? Like the questions that I was asking in the long COVID story, those are questions informed by having had conversations with patients and having, encountered the healthcare system and knowing the way in which the healthcare system works. So I think you can use your lived experience to write in first person, but you also can use your experience to help you understand what the right questions are to ask, and then go out and find the people who have had experiences like you that can shine a particular light about these conditions in a way that no one else could really understand, lest they have the experience itself.
We have many questions, but unfortunately, not a lot of time left. So I think the good news here is that these journalists will be open to hearing from you if you have questions or want to follow up. Excuse me. But Eli, let me let you take this opportunity to wrap things up and share your parting thoughts with your colleagues and with the fellows. You're on mute.
I'm on mute. Hard to sum it up cleanly. I think obviously very happy to chat with anyone after this talk. I am always looking for stories across the world to tell. Asako, actually am going to Japan for a story this year, and will be across the African subcontinent later this year. So obviously very keen to learn from you guys about how uh, um, a kid from New York could do a story about a place somewhere across the world in a way that's meaningful and respectful. I think in the spirit of respect, one of the things we didn't get to talking about, but that Jason, Taiwo, and I spent a lot of time talking about on our prep calls, was ethics of doing these kinds of stories. Taiwo spoke a little bit about this, and I will leave it to the two of them to think about or to elaborate a little bit on this. But I think whenever you're telling stories about incredibly vulnerable populations, including those who are sort of readily identifiable, which is a concern certainly in the U.S. under federal privacy laws. I think you have to handle those situations with care. I think apart from the legality of it, in terms of each of us trying to be stewards of the relationship between the public and the journalistic establishment, I think we have to be deeply considerate of the individuals we're reporting. We have to ensure we're not re-traumatizing. We have to ensure that we're giving them agency. We have to be respectful that they don't understand the process and explain the process to them. We need to involve them in the process more than we might traditionally be comfortable with in terms of ensuring that we're not extracting stories that then we're using to our own benefit or to our publication's benefit, but that we're really doing it with the spirit of, patience in mind. Even as I say it, I feel uncomfortable saying it, right? Because that doesn't mean sending quotes to people. That doesn't mean writing in a way that's going to make people happy. That doesn't mean giving anyone privileged access to anything. But it does mean that if a patient asks you, hey, we spent you came to Staten Island and you hung out with me for a day and we had a good connection. Actually, now I'm pretty nervous and I think I need to back out. That means in that situation, whereas, if I have like some Center for Medicare and Medicaid official who talks to me and then they're like, oh, I shouldn't have said half the thing I say, I'm like, well, you're kind of SOL, buddy. Like that was on you. In these situations, I think we just need to handle with care because the real goal is trust in journalism and trust in science and the ability for us to continue telling these stories, not to tell any single one of them. I want to pass it a little bit to Jason and Taiwo to talk about this ethics piece too, because I know it's really important to the two of you.
Yeah, at the center of what we do in journalism is ethics. Like I was saying, you cannot flout ethical rules just because you want to produce an excellent piece. of journalism. It's quite important. And now, one of the questions in the group chat talked about challenges I faced producing my story last year, and I could have done it better. Now, one of the major challenges that I faced was the fact that sickle cell patients they want to talk to. They spoke with me, but at the end of the day, they said they do not want their names mentioned. They do not want any pointers to whatever it is for people to know that they are the one talking. So I had an issue with them because I have to produce a credible story as well. Because credibility is the currency for journalists. So I had such an issue. At the end of the day, I couldn't use any of their voices, but I had to produce my story. So in speaking with patients, in speaking with survivors, you have to be very compassionate, very, very compassionate. So we have to hold this high level of ethical standard in health reporting because it's quite important. They need to trust journalists and they need to trust the kind of stories that we produce. So when you're faced with journalistic barriers, you need to assess yourself, you need to assess the story and think of the best way to tell the story without hurting the patient, the survivors, and all that. So it's quite important for us to hold the highest form of journalistic standard. Thank you.
Yeah, not much to add on to that. Both very well put. I would just add, like, logistically, when working on these kinds of stories and with patients, especially ones who don't have experience with the media prior, I will not share quotes in advance or send over a draft of the story, but I will walk them through the story in a level of detail that I would not necessarily with someone who is not who's a official or a scientist or something, so that they can see sort of both what we're taking from their story and like how it will be used, and like, hey, are you still okay with having this particular vulnerable detail included, like that whatever. So yeah, but very well put, Eli and
Well,
Taiwo.
this has been an absolutely extraordinary opportunity for exclusive insights from three very skilled professional journalists covering health issues. So I want to take this opportunity to first thank Eli Cahan for organizing the session and convening it and thinking it through, and also Taiwo Adebulu from TheCable in Nigeria, and Jason Mast of Stat News. Thank you all so much for sharing your knowledge and insights with NPF Fellows.